My name is Dakota Cross, I am 30 years old. If you had told me 5 years ago that the quietest piece of paper I would ever hold could rearrange an entire life, I would have smiled and kept walking along the river. I did not understand then how silence can be sharper than any raised voice. I only learned it the morning the envelope arrived at the bakery where I worked the early shift, the one with the big windows facing the Ohio River in Louisville. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on the notifications so you do not miss the rest of this story. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from. I still find it strange how far these ordinary private disasters can travel. I was standing behind the counter wiping flour from my hands when the process server walked in. He was polite, almost apologetic, the way people are when they know the contents of what they are delivering. He asked for me by my full married name. I signed for the envelope without thinking. Inside were legal papers filed by my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. The papers claimed I had been emotionally unstable, that I had neglected the children, and that I had been the one to abandon the marriage. Attached was a thick packet of witness statement transcripts, all carefully typed, all signed by people I had never met, all describing scenes that never happened. My first reaction was not anger. It was a slow, cold confusion, the kind that makes the edges of the room feel farther away than they should. I read the first page twice. Then I read the names of the people who had supposedly watched me fail as a mother. None of them existed in my real life. The bakery owner, Theo Brooks, came over when he saw my face and asked if I needed to sit down. I told him I needed to make a phone call. I called my husband first. He was at the construction site across the river where he managed a mid-size commercial project. When I told him what the papers said, there was a long pause. Then he said, very carefully, that his mother and his sister had mentioned concerns for a while, and that maybe we should all sit down and talk before anything went further. He did not sound shocked. That was the first real crack. I left the bakery early. Theo told me to take the rest of the day and not to worry about the shift. I walked the long way home along the river path, the one that runs behind the old warehouses and past the small park where the kids liked to feed the ducks. The air smelled like damp concrete and late spring. I kept the envelope under my arm the entire time, as if holding it tighter might make the words inside less true. When I reached our house in the Riverside neighborhood, my sister-in-law's car was already in the driveway. She was sitting on the front steps with a folder of her own. She looked calm, almost serene, the way people look when they have already decided the outcome. She stood up when she saw me and said, without raising her voice, that the papers were only the beginning of a necessary process, and that the children deserved stability I had not been providing. I asked her how she had obtained signed statements from people who did not exist. She smiled the small, patient smile she had always used when she thought I was being difficult. She said the statements were accurate in spirit even if some details had been adjusted for clarity. Then she told me that my mother-in-law had already spoken with a family court mediator and that the sooner I accepted the temporary custody arrangement they were proposing, the less painful everything would be for the children. I stood there on the sidewalk with the river moving steadily behind the houses and felt the ground under my feet become less reliable. My son Leo was 4 years old. The twin girls, June and Ivy, were the same age. They were inside the house with the neighbor who sometimes watched them after preschool. I could hear their voices through the open window, ordinary and bright. I did not go inside. I did not want them to see whatever was happening on my face. My sister-in-law continued speaking in that same measured tone. She said my mother-in-law had only ever wanted what was best for the family, and that my refusal to step back gracefully was the real problem. She mentioned the gossip that had already started circulating among the other parents at the preschool, how people were beginning to wonder about the late nights I spent at the bakery and the times I had asked for help with childcare. She said reputation was a fragile thing in a close neighborhood, and that once it started to crack it was hard to repair. I asked her why she was doing this. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, almost gently, that some people were simply not built for the kind of family my mother-in-law had spent decades protecting. Then she got into her car and drove away, leaving the second folder of papers on the porch step. I sat down on the curb and opened it. Inside were more witness transcripts, these ones claiming I had left the children alone for hours, that I had spoken harshly to them in public, that I had refused medical care for minor illnesses. Every page was formatted the same way, clean and official, with dates that did not match any real calendar of our lives. At the bottom of the last page was a short note in my mother-in-law's handwriting. It said only that the children would be safer with family who understood what permanence meant. I stayed on the curb until the light began to change. When I finally went inside, the neighbor handed me the children and left with a look that told me she had already heard something. Leo asked why my eyes were red. June offered me a drawing she had made of the river. Ivy simply leaned against my leg and stayed there, quiet and solid. I made them dinner and read them stories and put them to bed as if the day had been ordinary. After the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with both envelopes and began reading every page again, looking for the scene where the lies had been stitched together. The next morning I called a family attorney named Sophia Ortiz. Her office was in a converted brick building near the waterfront. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the papers. When I finished, she said the filings were aggressive but not airtight, and that the first step was to demand the original source material for every witness statement. She also said that once something like this entered the public record, the damage to a person standing in a community could move faster than any court schedule. I left her office with a temporary plan and a growing awareness that the quiet papers had already begun to do their work. By the time I reached the preschool that afternoon to pick up the children, 2 other mothers stopped speaking when I walked into the hallway. One of them looked at me with something that might have been pity. The other simply turned away. Leo ran to me with his usual force. The twins held my hands on the walk home and asked if we could stop at the bakery for the day-old bread Theo sometimes saved for them. I said yes, because the ordinary request felt like the only solid thing left in the day. That evening my husband came home later than usual. He sat across from me at the table after the children were asleep and said that his mother and his sister believed they were acting out of love. He said he did not want a war inside the family. He asked me to consider mediation before everything became more formal. I looked at him and realized that the papers had already reached him days earlier, and that he had chosen not to tell me until the process server made silence impossible. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked him whether he had read the witness statements. He said he had glanced at them. I asked him whether any of the scenes described matched anything he had ever seen with his own eyes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that perception could be complicated, and that maybe we all needed to step back and let cooler heads decide what was best for the children. I stood up and walked to the window that faced the river. The water moved the same way it always had. Behind me the house felt smaller than it had the day before. I understood then that the betrayal had not begun with the envelope. It had begun in conversations I had never been invited to join, in careful preparations that had taken months, in the quiet agreement between my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law that my place in the family was provisional. The following week the first anonymous tip reached the local parenting group online. It claimed I had been seen leaving the children unsupervised near the river path. Within hours the post had comments. Some of them were from people who used their real names. Most were not. The preschool director called me in for a meeting to discuss community concerns. My shifts at the bakery grew quieter. Customers who used to linger now took their orders and left. I kept showing up. I kept the children's routine steady. I met with Sophia Ortiz twice more and began the slow process of requesting the underlying documents behind every statement. Each request was met with delay. Each delay gave the gossip more time to settle into the neighborhood like a low fog. On a Thursday afternoon, while the children were at a supervised play group, I received a call from Cole Turner, a private investigator Sophia had recommended. He said he had already located one of the supposed witnesses listed in the transcripts. The address on the statement led to an empty lot. The phone number belonged to a disconnected line. He told me the pattern was consistent across 3 of the names so far. Then he said something that made the river path outside my window feel suddenly narrower. He had found a payment record connecting my sister-in-law's personal account to a small document preparation service 2 counties over. I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened to the rest of what he had. The service specialized in creating formal-looking statements for civil filings. The invoices were careful, almost elegant. They matched the dates on the papers I still kept in the top drawer of the dresser. When the call ended, I stayed where I was for a long time. The house was quiet. Outside, the late light moved across the water the way it always did. I understood that the next step would not be quiet. Once the proof of fabrication entered the formal record, the careful story my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law had built would begin to collapse. I also understood that the collapse would not restore what had already been taken. Reputation, once questioned in a small riverside neighborhood, does not return to its original shape. I stood up and went to the kitchen to start dinner before the children came home. I set the table for 4. I measured the ordinary ingredients the way I always had. Somewhere under the calm surface of the afternoon a different kind of clock had started running, and I could feel every second of it. The next morning I drove the children to preschool along the same river road we always took, the windows cracked open so the early air could move through the car. Leo talked about the wooden blocks he planned to stack higher than the teacher's desk. June and Ivy sat in the back seat sharing a single pair of socks they had decided belonged to both of them. I listened the way I always had, answering when they needed answers, and tried not to calculate how many of the other parents had already read the anonymous post. At drop-off, the director, a calm woman named Lena Soto, asked if she could speak with me for a moment. We stood in the small office that smelled of crayons and hand soap. She said several families had expressed concern after seeing online comments about unsupervised time near the water. She was required to document the conversation. She did not accuse me of anything. She simply recorded that the conversation had occurred. When I left the office, the hallway felt longer than it had the day before. I went straight to Sofia Ortiz's office. She had already received the first round of formal responses from the other side. My mother-in-law's attorney had refused to produce the original source material for the witness statements, citing privacy. Sophia said the refusal itself was useful. She also said Cole Turner had located a second empty address and a third disconnected number. The pattern was no longer coincidence. He had subpoenaed the payment records from the document preparation service and expected them within 10 days. While I sat in her office, my phone lit up with a message from the parenting group. Someone had posted a photograph of me walking the children home the previous afternoon. The caption asked whether the children looked tired or underfed. The comments underneath were a mixture of concern and quiet judgment. I put the phone face down on the table and did not pick it up again until the meeting ended. That evening my husband came home with a different kind of silence. He sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and said his mother had called him during the day. She had told him that continuing to live under the same roof while the filings were active would only complicate the temporary custody request they intended to make. He said he was considering staying at his sister's house for a few nights so the children would not feel the tension. I asked him whether he believed the statements. He looked at the table and said belief was not the point. Perception in a small community mattered, and the children should not become the center of public speculation. I did not argue. I simply told him that if he left the house he should understand he was choosing a side, even if he preferred to call it neutrality. He packed a small bag the next morning while the children ate cereal. Leo asked where he was going. My husband said he had work that would keep him late. June and Ivy accepted the answer the way children accept most adult explanations, with more trust than the explanation deserved. After he drove away, I stood in the doorway and watched the empty driveway for longer than I needed to. The following week the gossip hardened into something more organized. A second anonymous tip appeared, this one claiming I had taken money from the bakery cash drawer. Theo Brooks called me into the back room the moment I arrived for my shift. He looked tired. He said the tip had reached 2 regular customers who had asked him directly whether the story was true. He told them it was not. He also told me he had checked the deposit records himself and found nothing missing. Still, the question had been asked in public, and questions like that do not disappear simply because they are answered. I finished my shift and walked the long way home again. The river was high from recent rain. I stopped at the small overlook where the path widened and sat on the low wall. Cole Turner called while I was sitting there. He had the payment records. 3 separate transfers from my sister-in-law's personal account to the document service, each one timed to the creation dates of the witness packets. He also had an internal email from the service confirming that the statements had been drafted from client-supplied narratives rather than from any independent interviews. The email named my sister-in-law as the client contact. I thanked him and ended the call. For a long time I stayed on the wall and watched the water move past the city. The proof was no longer a theory. It was a set of numbers and dates and an email that could be entered into evidence. Yet the knowledge did not feel like victory. It felt like standing in a room after the furniture has been removed and realizing how much larger the empty space is than you expected. That night I called Sophia Ortiz and forwarded everything Cole had sent. She said she would file an emergency motion to compel production of the original materials and to request sanctions for the fabricated statements. She also said the hearing would almost certainly become public knowledge in a neighborhood the size of ours. I told her to file it. 2 days later the motion appeared on the court docket. By evening the parenting group had screenshots. The comments shifted from vague concern to open speculation about fraud. Some people who had been silent before now wrote that they had always found the original accusations too detailed to be believable. Others doubled down, insisting that where there was smoke there must be fire. The preschool director called again, this time to say that 2 families had requested their children not be placed in the same classroom groups as mine until the matter was resolved. I kept the children's days as steady as I could. We still walked the river path after dinner when the weather allowed. Leo still argued for one more story. June and Ivy still negotiated the exact number of minutes they could stay in the bath. I answered every ordinary request with the same calm voice I had always used, because the ordinary was the only ground that still felt solid under all of us. On a Tuesday afternoon my sister-in-law appeared at the bakery during the slow hour between lunch and the after-school rush. She ordered nothing. She simply stood on the customer side of the counter and said that the emergency motion was a mistake. She said my mother-in-law had only ever tried to protect the family's name, and that forcing the documents into open court would destroy more than it would repair. She asked me whether I had considered what the children would feel when they eventually learned their mother had chosen a public fight over quiet resolution. I looked at her across the polished wood and answered in the same even tone she had always used with me. I told her the quiet resolution she preferred required me to accept a set of lies as the official record of my life. I told her I would not do that. She held my gaze for several seconds, then turned and left without another word. Theo, who had been wiping down the espresso machine, said nothing, but he refilled my water glass and left it within reach. That evening my husband returned to the house for the first time in 8 days. He stood in the living room while the children ran to him and climbed onto the couch. After they had settled he asked if we could talk once they were asleep. When the house was finally quiet he sat across from me and said his mother had shown him the payment records that afternoon. She had claimed the transfers were for legitimate consulting work unrelated to any legal filings. He said he no longer knew which version of events to believe. I placed the printed email from the document service on the table between us and watched him read it twice. He folded the page carefully and set it down. For a long time neither of us spoke. Outside the window the river continued its steady progress past the neighborhood, indifferent to the papers and the posts and the careful stories people told about one another. Inside the house the only sound was the soft click of the old refrigerator cycling on. I told him the hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I told him I would be there with every piece of evidence Cole Turner had gathered. I told him he was free to sit on whichever side of the courtroom felt true to him. He looked at the folded page for another moment, then stood and said he needed air. He left through the front door and did not come back that night. I locked the door, checked on the children, and returned to the kitchen table. The printed records lay under the lamp exactly where he had left them. I did not put them away. I simply sat with the quiet knowledge that the next time the family gathered around any table, the shape of the room would be permanently different. The clock that had started running the afternoon the first envelope arrived was still moving, and Thursday was no longer a distant date on a calendar. It was the next solid marker on a path that had already begun to narrow. Thursday arrived the way most ordinary days arrive in a riverside neighborhood, with the same early light on the water and the same steady traffic along the road that ran past the bakery. I dressed the children in clean clothes, packed their bags for a longer day at preschool, and drove them there myself. Lena Soto met me at the door and simply said she would keep their routine as normal as possible. I thanked her and drove to the courthouse alone. Sofia Ortiz was already waiting on the steps with a thin folder that held every payment record, every empty address, and the internal email from the document service. Cole Turner stood a few feet away, ready if the judge required additional testimony. We walked inside together. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, with pale walls and a single window that looked out toward the river. My mother-in-law and my sister-in-law sat on the opposite side with their attorney. My husband sat in the back row, alone. The judge reviewed the emergency motion in silence for several minutes. When she looked up, she asked for the original source material behind the witness statements. The other attorney began to speak about privacy and good faith concerns. Sofia placed the payment records and the service email on the table and asked the court to note the dates and the named client contact. The room stayed very quiet while the judge read. My sister-in-law's face did not change, but her hands tightened around the edge of the table. My mother-in-law sat perfectly still. When the judge asked whether either of them wished to address the discrepancies, my mother-in-law said only that the family had acted to protect the children from instability. The judge asked whether the statements had been independently verified. There was a longer silence. Then my sister-in-law said the narratives had been based on collective observations within the family. The judge looked at the email again and noted that collective observation did not explain fabricated names, disconnected numbers, or paid document drafting. The ruling was clear and immediate. The temporary custody request was denied. The fabricated statements were struck from the record. The court ordered both my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law to cover the costs of the emergency motion and referred the matter of the false filings for further review. No one raised their voice. The entire exchange lasted less than 40 minutes. When it ended, I walked out into the hallway and stood for a moment against the cool wall, feeling the exact weight of a decision that could not be unspoken. Outside on the courthouse steps, my husband approached. He said he had read every page Sofia submitted. He said he understood now that the statements had never been real. He asked whether we could talk about the children and about the house. I told him the children would be home at the usual time and that any conversation about the future would happen only after the formal record was fully cleared. He nodded once and left without asking to come with me. I picked the children up from preschool and took them to the bakery. Theo had saved 3-day-old rolls and a small bag of the cinnamon sugar cookies the twins liked. We sat at the corner table by the window and watched the river while they ate. Leo asked if the important meeting had gone well. I told him it had. June and Ivy leaned against my sides the way they always did when the day felt longer than usual. No one in the bakery stared. The ordinary noise of the afternoon continued around us as if the morning had been no different from any other. In the weeks that followed, the public record did its quiet work. The parenting group posts slowed and then stopped. 2 of the families who had requested classroom separation sent short messages saying they had misunderstood. Lena Soto called to say the preschool would return to its regular grouping. Cole Turner sent a final report confirming that the document service had cooperated fully once the court order was in place. The further review resulted in a formal written acknowledgement from both my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law that the statements had been prepared without independent verification. The acknowledgement was entered into the permanent court file. My sister-in-law stopped coming to the neighborhood. My mother-in-law's standing among the extended relatives shifted in ways I only heard about secondhand. Invitations that had once been automatic were no longer extended to her in the same way. Alliances that had seemed permanent simply thinned and then disappeared. I did not celebrate any of it. I simply noted the change the way you note the river dropping after a long high season. My husband returned to the house 3 weeks after the hearing. He slept in the guest room at first. We spoke only about the children's schedules and the grocery list and the broken hinge on the back door. One evening after the children were asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and said he had been wrong to leave when the papers first arrived. He said he had chosen the quieter path because it felt safer, and that safety had cost all of us something that could not be fully restored. I listened. I did not offer immediate forgiveness. I told him the only measure that mattered now was whether he showed up for the ordinary days the same way he had once shown up for the easy ones. He nodded and did not push further. The months settled into a new pattern that looked, from the outside, almost like the old one. I kept my shifts at the bakery. The children still walked the river path after dinner when the weather allowed. Leo still argued for one more story. June and Ivy still negotiated bath time with the seriousness of small diplomats. My husband repaired the hinge and learned the exact way June liked her toast cut. Some evenings the four of us sat on the low wall overlooking the water and said very little. The silence no longer felt like a threat. It felt like ground that had been tested and had held. I did not invite my mother-in-law or my sister-in-law back into the children's lives. When a relative asked whether the door might open again someday, I answered that the door had been closed by the same hands that filed the first papers, and that I would not reopen it for the sake of appearances. The answer was quiet and final. No one asked a second time. There are still moments when I open the drawer where I keep the original envelopes and look at the clean typed pages. The lies are still there, permanent in their own way. But they no longer decide the shape of any day. The children are steady. The house is ours in practice, if not always in perfect peace. I go to work. I come home. I measure flour and answer questions about ducks and wooden towers and the exact number of cookies that constitute a fair share. I used to believe that family meant enduring whatever was placed in front of you because the alternative was loneliness. I no longer believe that. Family is not ownership. It is not the right to rewrite another person's life in cleaner language so the story fits a preferred version of loyalty. The quiet strength I carry now is simply the decision to stop performing a role that required me to disappear. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If you ever find yourself holding papers that try to tell a false version of your own life, would you choose yourself even when the cost is every familiar alliance you once thought you needed?